would be difficult to say exactly when Jimmy became restless and discontented. Impossible to point at any one incident or event and say that was when it began. Suffice it to say that, from a reasonably contented Trinidadian, he became, over a period of months, a highly discontented human being, thoroughly disgusted with his surroundings, his teaching job, and his way of life. Little things which formerly he had not noticed now became major grievances. Every time his car hit a pothole, he cursed the island, her people, and her government. Haphazard garbage collection and his overcrowded classroom all did their part to hasten his decision to offer his brain for draining. Wider horizons beckoned him, and far-off pastures became more alluring. What if he had a good job and a house of his own? The prophets of doom were quick to point out how much he would be leaving behind, but friends returning from North America painted a glowing picture of their lifestyle and the wonderful opportunities offered. From the thought to the actuality, there stretched the long road of form filling, medicals, and sundry bits of red tape. But Jimmy braved the hurdles and emerged triumphant with his Canadian visa. On a bright morning in September, he arrived at Piarco, bound for the Promised Land, his Mecca, the big country with the big heart. He was leaving his highlands in the sun with no regrets, just a deep sympathy for those who would remain behind in this God-forsaken place. Piarco, as usual, was jammed full of people. Trinidadians obey an unwritten law wherein it is stated that no son or daughter of the soil shall be allowed to leave the island without an escort of at least 20 well-wishers seeing him or her off. All this, of course, resulting as it inevitably did in complete chaos, was another source of annoyance to Jimmy. Passengers and non-passengers mingled merrily with no regard for signs to the contrary. People entered blithely through doors marked exit and left through doors marked entry. As far as Jimmy was concerned, the whole thing was typical. No organizations at all. By some miracle, planes managed to leave more or less on time, and passengers somehow boarded the correct aircraft. Seated finally in his Toronto-bound plane, Jimmy breathed a sigh of relief, and happily bade farewell to potholes and all the other trials and tribulations which had beset his life up to then. The future glowed with bright promise. Toronto Airport bristled with efficiency. Baggage was collected with effortless ease, and Jimmy, practically dizzy with happiness, stood at the immigration desk. "May I see your passport and visa, sir, please?" The officer was very efficient, and Jimmy fumbled through his briefcase for the precious documents. Very much aware of the waiting line of people, he finally located them. "Here you are, sir." Unsmilingly, the officer scrutinized the papers, then stamped them, "Landed immigrant," and Jimmy passed through the portals into paradise. "Hey Jimmy, over here, boy." Coming through the crowd was Vishnu, grinning broadly, waiting to meet him as promised. "It's good to see you, boy. I have a taxi waiting." Then they drive into the city. Huge buildings, neon lights, the whole panorama spread before him. The car finally came to a stop before a very tall building. "It's called a high-rise, boy, 20 floors. We live on the 10th. Jimmy stood on the pavement and gazed about. A fountain splashed in the court of the building, illuminated by a floodlight, and trees grew in a semicircle around the court. Vishnu watched him with an amused expression on his face. "We have a swimming pool on the 4th floor and even a sauna bath." Jimmy, suitably impressed, replied, "Vishnu, this is real like little class living, boy." Inside they entered the express elevator, reaching the 10th floor about 20 seconds before Jimmy's stomach. "That thing always travels so fast, boy." You get used to it, man. The one-bedroom apartment seemed small, but Vishnu said it was plenty big enough for three of them. Smokey, the other occupant, worked nights, and $155 split three ways was a lot easier to meet. You brought some rum, boy? Of course, man. Vishnu grinned. Some of the boys coming over for an old talk and drink. Just then a noise like a ship in distress filled the apartment, causing Jimmy to leap from his chair. What happened? What happened? Vishnu doubled up with laughter. It's only the intercom, man. The boys reached. Soon the room was filled with laughing Trinidadians. Where are you from, man? Questions were fired at him from all sides, as representatives from San Juan, Belmont, San Fernando, Coeva, and it seemed every little town and village in Trinidad tried to absorb the news from home. As the old talk questions went on, Jimmy gradually became aware that the picture now being painted of Canadian life was totally unlike the one painted by the boys on holiday at home. Man, this place hard. 6 months a year and it's only security guard job I get. This from a former civil servant. Wait till you register with Manpower and they give you the old no Canadian experience run. Jimmy, feeling very superior, retorted, but I have my degree, man. Surely I won't have any trouble. There was general laughter all around. Why? Nobody told you they have PhD and welfare here? A nagging worry emerged at the back of Jimmy's mind. Supposing he couldn't get a job? No, that was impossible. If he couldn't get a teaching job, he could always go into civil service. On a cold, windswept Toronto street, a lone figure walked, head bent, and collar turned up against the icy wind. It was 1 o'clock on a bleak December morning, and Jimmy was on his way home from work. Numbed with the cold, he watched a flashing neon light and remembered how wonderful it had all seemed in September. Even during those first weeks of disappointment and humiliation, the warm sun and shining streets were like a fairy tale. He had been optimistic, sure he'd get a job before his money ran out. When it became obvious that a teaching job was out of the question, he had tried the civil service. They wouldn't even let him take the examinations. He was too well qualified, they said, for a clerical job. Gradually he lowered his demands. As his money ran out, his visit to the Manpower office became desperate. Daily he searched newspapers, made phone calls, waited for hours in waiting rooms, filled out endless application forms, and senseless IQ tests, always with the same results. Sorry, you do not have Canadian experience. Nobody could tell him how he was to acquire this experience if he couldn't get a job. Then came the final degradation. Applying for a job as a hotel porter. He was lucky he got it, and with tips he was financially better off than he had been at home. Yet now he lived constantly with nostalgia, and all the old talk with the boys hinted around the next trip home. The very things which had annoyed him now became infinitely precious. The disregard for time, the laughing informality were symbols of friendliness in an unfriendly city. The other things like poor sanitation and bad roads became, in retrospect, symbolic of his own non-involvement. There were things wrong at home, certainly, but was he helping to correct them by living in North America? Next year, perhaps, he would get a teaching job, but at least he would always be an alien. He and the boys clinging together in a strange city, trying to maintain their identity as Trinidadians. The thing was, it took a lot of courage to go home and admit you had been wrong, and most of them talked at that. Jimmy raised his head to face the icy wind and remembered weekends at Maracas with the hot sun and the sparkling sea. Tonight when he got to the apartment, he was going to write a letter. Maybe he could get his old job back. He was a Trinidadian, born to live in a warm climate with warm, vital people. There was no shame in that. This time he wouldn't just browse about things. He would do what he could to help. Maybe he wouldn't be able to change things for a long, long time, but at least he'd be trying. And most of all, he would be helping to make his own country a better place to live in. Jimmy smiled now at the thought of going back home. He pictured Piarco as it had been on the day he left for Toronto, jammed full of people. He hoped that they would all be there to meet him on his return. This is the story Paradise Lost by Ida Ramasar.